So like Kevin said, the last 4 weeks we've been doing this series called Intent, and it's all about what has Jesus intended the church to be? What is the DNA that he has instilled into the church so that it functions the way he wants it to function? And the first week, Kevin talked to us about how the only reason that we do what we do is because we're empowered by the Spirit. We have the Spirit of Jesus pushing us all along the way to accomplish the goal that Jesus has given to the church. The second week, Parker talked about the fact that the church has a story to tell and that every individual within the church has a unique story to bring and tell the world. The third week, Randy talked about the fact that the church is designed to serve, that every person here is designed to be a servant to every person in the world. And then last week, Kevin talked about the fact that the church is designed as a symphony, where each individual person brings their voice to contribute to this ongoing work of art that is called the church. And that if you don't do that, if you don't bring your voice, your talents, your person to this, then the symphony just doesn't sound quite as good. So this morning, we're going to continue in that theme. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, those are all S's, right? So it's kind of easy to remember. It's tricky. But we're going to be talking about the fifth S, which is Sabbath, and how this is a very important piece to incorporate into the DNA of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So maybe some of you have heard the word Sabbath before, and you're like, I think I know what that means, but I'm not 100% sure what that means. Maybe some of you are thinking that, I thought that was like a Jewish thing. Why are we talking about that on church? Why are we doing this on a Sunday morning? And then maybe some of you grew up, if you grew up in the church, like maybe you had people tell you that Sunday was the Sabbath, right? And that you weren't allowed to do a bunch of stuff on the Sabbath, right? Like there was all these rules and stuff that you couldn't do on Sunday or on Saturday or whatever the day was. But we all bring these different notions of Sabbath to this conversation. So I want us to all just kind of check that for a second, and we're going to talk about the fundamental first meaning of the word Sabbath, okay? It's a Hebrew word. It's actually Shabbat, but, we don't say the H, so it's Sabbath. But it comes from a Hebrew word, which basically just means to stop, to cease, to rest. And according to Genesis chapter 2, it is the very first thing that God did after he finished creating the heavens and the earth. So we're going to look there. If you want to get your Bibles out, if you have those, you can turn to Genesis chapter 2. It's right there in the beginning. And we're going to read about what happened after this whole creation process was over. Genesis 2, 1 through 3 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all of their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation." Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, to me that just sounded weird, right? That God would rest. Like, I thought he was supposed to be all powerful and like he never got tired. Why is God taking a break after this creation process, right? Maybe he was just anticipating the 1981 Loverboy hit, "Everybody's Working for the Weekend," right? Some of you guys know that song, okay. But the problem is, the reason that sounds so weird to us, the reason that it sounds foreign, that God would rest, is because we are not ancient Israelite people, okay? If you had lived thousands of years ago and you were an Israelite, all of this would have made perfect sense to you, okay? So we're going to explain exactly what's happening here in Genesis 2, and it might be surprising, like you may not have heard this before, but in the ancient world, there were all kinds of creation stories floating around out there. Every ancient nation and ancient culture had its own story, and they all sounded sort of like Genesis, but they weren't the same. The one thing that was pretty common in all of these stories was that it had a story about one God, or maybe a couple of gods, getting into a fight and somehow creating the world as we know it. And the climax of that creation story always resulted in the God, the main God, building himself or herself a temple as an act of authority of mastering this awesome creation. So at this temple, this is where the God's authority was recognized and rested. And the temple wasn't a temple until the God came and lived in it, okay? And they had a way of saying when the God would come into the temple, they would say that the God's presence rested in the temple. So what's really wild about Genesis 2 is that it's kind of like all these other creation stories, except it has this one big statement that it's making that none of these other statements are being said in these other ancient cultures. That statement is that the entire earth is God's temple. Like everything that you see when you go outside, the mountains, the rivers, the ocean, the desert, all of this stuff, God lives here. God has dominion here. His presence is here, it's resting here, and he is in control. So when Genesis chapter 2 talks about God resting, when God takes a Sabbath, God is essentially saying, this is where I live. This is where I exhibit my control. This is where I reign and rule. And so when the ancient Israelites would have heard this about God resting at the end of creation, they would have said, God's where he's supposed to be. God's doing what God is supposed to be doing. He's administrating his rule over his creation. So in Exodus, in the Ten Commandments, right, most of us probably heard about the Ten Commandments. There's a specific command about the Sabbath. And this is what that command says. It says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So God commands these Israelites to do what he does on the seventh day, to rest. And in doing this, in taking a Sabbath, what they are doing is essentially acknowledging the fact that God is the one who is in control of his heavens and his earth. When the Israelites take a break from their work, what they're doing is they're saying, like, we realize that all of this stuff is not dependent on us, that God is the one who makes the crops grow, that God is the one who gives us children, that God is the one who gives us everything, and we don't need to work today because God is in control. That's how they pictured this Sabbath day going. But there's actually a second image that we're given in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15, and that's what Rachel read at the beginning. And this is what Deuteronomy says. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So far, same thing, right? As the Lord your God commanded you. But this is where it changes. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So we have two commands about the same day, but very different reasons are given. This second one here in Deuteronomy specifically relates to the story of Israel, right? If you've ever read the book of Exodus, it's all about God coming in and becoming the God of Israel. So Israel has been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. God hears their cries of slavery, and he comes down, he sends Moses and Aaron into Egypt. They lead them out. They walk through an ocean which parts before them. God gives them his law. He leads them through the desert and then delivers them into the promised land of Israel. It's this amazing story. It is the foundational story of Israel. It defined them. And what Deuteronomy says is when you keep the Sabbath, you're to remember that story. When you keep the Sabbath, you are to remember that you are no longer slaves. In Egypt, you were defined by your work. You were a commodity. You were defined by the amount of bricks that you could produce in a day. No more. You are something else. You are Israel. You are God's people. And in this act of release from slavery, God gave Israel a new identity. And part of keeping the Sabbath was acknowledging that identity, that they were no longer slaves. So, there's these two images. The fact that God is in control and the fact that we're no longer slaves. John Walton, who really championed this idea that the Sabbath, this seventh day, is about God being in control, he says this. He says, when we rest on the Sabbath, we recognize God as the author of order and the one who brings rest, stability to our lives and world. We take our hands off the controls of our lives and acknowledge Him as the one who is in control. Most importantly, this calls on us to step back from our workaday world, those means by which we try to provide for ourselves and gain control of our circumstances. Sabbath is for recognizing that God is the one who provides for us and who is the master of our lives and world. So if all of this is true, if Sabbath is about this God who is in control and the fact that we're no longer slaves, why are we so bad at it? Why do we as Christians not go after this Sabbath as wholeheartedly as we go after some of the other things that we're concerned about as Christians? Why has Sabbath been left alone? Some of this goes back to the New Testament. If you've ever read the Gospels, Jesus has these encounters with these people called Pharisees, and Sabbath was like their big thing, right? Sabbath was the most holy, sacred thing that they could think of, and they built these fences around the Sabbath. That's what they called them. So they instituted all these additional laws to make sure nobody broke the Sabbath. And for Jesus, this just wasn't the way to go about Sabbath. And this is what he says in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. He says, Sabbath was not made for humankind. The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So Jesus says, hey, not only is this something that you're supposed to be a slave to, which is kind of ironic, right? To be a slave to the Sabbath, that's just not how it's supposed to work. Jesus comes in and says, I'm actually in control of even this. Like, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. And you know that had to get to him a little bit. But the thing is that Judaism later on would adopt this exact same principle. In this book called the Makilta, the ancient rabbis say this, and it's almost word for word what Jesus says in the Gospels. It says, the Sabbath is given unto you, not you unto the Sabbath. So even the Jews realize, like, the Sabbath is a sacred thing, but it's not something that's supposed to become a long list of rules. The way that we're supposed to approach Sabbath is not to think of it as all these things that God wants us to do or to not do on this certain day. The Sabbath is a window of opportunity to participate with God, to be with God and acknowledge Him as the ruler of the world, to acknowledge the fact that we are different people, that we are no longer slaves. We tend to, as Americans, idolize work. What's the first thing you do when you introduce yourself to somebody? What's the first question that's asked? What do you do? That's like our number one identity as Americans. It's the first thing that we go to when we're introducing ourselves. And we think of rest as this thing that we get to do after we've done all our work, right? That's retirement, that's the weekend. It's just this break that we get to do so that we get enough energy to build back up to go back out and work again. That's not what Sabbath is. Sabbath is an end to itself. Sabbath is the goal. And it's a lifestyle that we have to enter into. Until we see rest, this Sabbath, as a means to its own end, we're never going to know what this true, whole, complete rest is that Jesus is offering to us. A true Sabbath can only happen once we take the controls out of our hands, give them to God, and acknowledge the fact that He is the one that's in control. And I think as the church, this being a part of our DNA, we have to recapture this notion of Sabbath if we're going to be the church that Jesus designed us to be. We have to adopt this way of living because that's what Jesus intended for us. See, the problem with the way that we do things, especially in America, is that we like to think that we are in control. We believe, sometimes even as the church, that the work of the kingdom is all up to us. And that if we're not out there, if we're not talking to this person, then salvation's not going to come to anybody. And I think that way of thinking arises from a lack of Sabbath. This season that we're in, I don't know if you watch TV or read the newspaper or have a pulse, but we're in an election season, and there's all kinds of anxiety around this. We're not going to name names, but there are people that you think that if they get in the Oval Office, this whole world's going to come crashing down. And on the flip side, you think, if only we could get back to this, then our country would be the way it's supposed to be and order would be restored. And we get into these conversations and we get so defensive and mean, and it's all because of a lack of Sabbath. It's all because of this thinking that says that the political currents in our country are what will define order and peace in the world. And Jesus came to install a kingdom that does not depend on that. Sabbath living acknowledges that kingdom and is not concerned about the political ups and downs of our country. What happens with Second Amendment rights, with the stick figure on a bathroom door, with where public prayer is and isn't allowed, God has been and will continue to be in control regardless of what happens in those scenarios. And until we embrace a Sabbath lifestyle that is at peace with the fact that the creator of the universe is the one who is in control, until we accept a Sabbath living that says, I am no longer a slave to the fear, I am no longer a slave to money, I am no longer a slave to this stuff, I am no longer a slave to what other people think of me. We're never going to embody the church that Jesus designed us to be. And it revolves around this Sabbath piece of DNA, this crucial element that Jesus has put into the church to make it work. The thing about this Sabbath is that it's not designed to be something that you enter into alone. The beautiful thing about Sabbath originally was that it was the same day of the week. So it was a community event. Everybody was doing this at the same time. And even today, Sabbath is something that we have to do as a community if it's going to be successful. We have to do it as a church if we're going to embody the DNA that Jesus put into us. The author of Hebrews in chapter 4, verses 9 through 11, explicitly tells this to the church. Okay, this bunch of Jewish Christians who are having a hard time kind of getting their head around Jesus. This is what the author of Hebrews says. He says, so then a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. It still remains. Even though you've been baptized, even though you're a part of the church, even though you do all of these things, the Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also cease from their labors as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter into that rest. So the question is how do we do that, right? I'm a big proponent. If I'm going to tell you you have to do something, then I need to at least give you some suggestions as to how to make that happen. So how do we adopt this Sabbath living? How do we make it a part of our daily rhythm? This list is not exhaustive, okay? So you can add or subtract to whatever. You don't have to do all of them. Just pick one. It's a good starting point. The first suggestion that I have is that we unplug. That we get off social media, we turn off the television, we get off our phones, iPads, all of these things that we use to distract ourselves, these things that just pump out white noise to keep us numb from what's actually happening in our hearts and around us, that we look up, and for 24 hours, we engage the world that's actually around us. I think this is maybe like the most crucial thing that we can do as Christians, is for 24 hours to unplug, because that's weird, right? In our culture, that's a weird thing to go without your phone for 24 hours. But this is what's necessary if we're going to separate ourselves and feel this rest that God is inviting us into. The second one is, it's actually a part of what the ancient Sabbath tradition is, which is don't spend money for 24 hours. Go out of your way a day before you're going to do like a Sabbath rest and make sure that you don't have to spend any money. That is a statement that you are free from the anxiety of money and finances, and that you are not participating for one 24-hour period in our anxious culture of wealth acquisition. It's a profound statement. The third thing that I have is read a book. 30% of Americans almost last year did not read one book, did not even start a book. 30%. I mean, you could try it just like with maybe your Bible, but you could also read other things that are bringing life and encouraging ideas in ways that you can enter into rest. The fourth thing, enjoy your favorite thing. Favorite food, favorite drink, favorite activity. Indulge yourself. Let it be a statement about the goodness of God's creation. This is what Sabbath was intended to be. The fifth thing is have a meaningful conversation. Go beyond the surface level. We can have a whole conversation and not have said anything sometimes. Take a 24-hour period and have an intentional conversation with someone that seeks to get below the, hey, how are you? What are you doing? How's this going? Number 6, have a game night. Just do something fun. Celebrate. Make it not about being or doing something, but just being with a group of people having fun. And then 7 is kind of like this, is invite other people into your Sabbath. The whole part of this DNA piece is taking the kingdom to every home, neighborhood, and city, right? How are you going to do that if you don't invite people into that Sabbath with you? So these are just some ideas to throw out there, but these are ways that we can enter into this rest that the Bible talks about when it talks about the Sabbath. Jesus entrusted us with this task of doing this, and the work has already been accomplished. In the death and resurrection of Jesus, it's all done. Like, you don't have to save anybody. I don't know if you know that, but you don't actually have to save anybody. That's already been done. All you've been asked to do is to go, be sent, and to be the people of God who live in the reality. And in order to live in that reality, you must Sabbath. You must stop. Because if you do not, this culture will inundate you with other messages about who you are and what you're supposed to be doing, and you're not going to embody the DNA that Jesus has put into you. We have to stop. We have to take a rest once a week at least and remind ourselves that no matter what's happening, no matter what's being said in the news, no matter what's happening in our family, God is in control. And that we serve a God who has liberated us from the slavery of our past, the slavery of work, the slavery of fear, the slavery of control, the slavery of money, the slavery of sex, the slavery of all these things that tie us down, and that we have a new identity as children of God. That is the message of Sabbath. And until we stop, until we incorporate that into our lives, we're not going to hear that message. We're getting ready to sing a song, and I encourage this to be a moment of decision, a moment of invitation to enter into God's rest, to make a commitment to incorporating Sabbath into the rhythm of your life. Because without it, you will miss the voice that says you're no longer a slave. You will miss the voice that says, God's not in control. It's up to you. It's up to this person. Stop. Breathe. Hear the words that you are no longer a slave. You are a child of God.